You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast, the hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from thechrisvossshow.com, thechrisvossshow.com. Hey, coming here with another great podcast. We certainly appreciate you guys tuning in. Be sure to put your arm around that friend, neighbor, relative. Tell them to subscribe to the Chris Voss Show and join the wonderful family that loves you but does not judge you. The best kind of family there is. Go to youtube.com/Chris Voss. Hit the bell notification button over there. Go to goodreads.com. See everything we're reading and reviewing over there as well. Go to all our groups, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, the big LinkedIn group, 122,000 people over there. Our LinkedIn newsletter, that thing is killing it. People love that thing, and it just keeps growing like a monster. So we're excited to announce my new book is coming out. It's called Beacons of Leadership, Inspiring Lessons of Success in Business and Innovation. It's going to be coming out on October 5th, 2021, and I'm really excited for you to get a chance to read this book. It's filled with a multitude of my insightful stories, lessons, my life, and experiences in leadership and character. I give you some of the secrets from my CEO entrepreneurial toolbox that I use to scale my business success, innovate, and build a multitude of companies. I've been a CEO for, 33, 35 years now. We talk about leadership, the importance of leadership, how to become a great leader, and how anyone can become a great leader as well. Or order the book wherever fine books are sold. Anyway, guys, we have an amazing author on the show today. His new paperback version of his book that came out in 2019 is out tomorrow, May 31st, 2022. The Cost of Chaos: The Trump Administration and the World by Peter Bergen. He's on the show with us today talking about this amazing book of his. He is a journalist, author, documentary producer, and vice president for global studies and fellows at New America, a professor of practice at Arizona State University, a fellow at Fordham University Center on National Security, and CNN's national security analyst. Welcome to the show, Peter. How are you?
Chris, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on. We certainly appreciate it. And congratulations on the paperback issuance of your book. You've written a lot of different books, actually. How many books have you put?
This is my 10th book, if you count the ones I've co-edited with other people, but my 7th real book. When I say real book, non-edited volume. Edited volumes are real books, but they're not quite as personal. This book I updated and I revised. I finished it. It came out in 2019, as you mentioned, so a lot of other things happened. And originally in the hardcover, the title was Trump and His Generals, and it really focused on that relationship because that was so critical to the first 2 years. If you think about H.R. McMaster, think about Jim Mattis, think about General Kelly, think about the generals that surrounded, or General Flynn, that surrounded President Trump when he came in. They were all gone by the end of year two. Mm-hmm. And I think that you can the Trump presidency changed over time. It became, there was this cliche about the grown-ups in the room and they were trying to control Trump. Well, the cliche wasn't entirely wrong. And certainly, I think if you look at the first 2 years, it was a more normal administration in a sense. I give Trump his due. I think he got some big things, and I think he got a lot of big things wrong. Let's start with the big things that he got right, in fairness. He built on the Obama plan to defeat ISIS. And it was very much an Obama plan that he amped up. He, of course, ordered the operation in which Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi died, the guy who founded ISIS. So that was certainly an achievement. And I was surprised that he didn't mention it more in the campaign. Mm-hmm. Operation Warp Speed is very much the Trump administration made a lot of failures with COVID, which I'll get to in a minute. But on the Operation Warp Speed, they gave Moderna $2.5 billion. They ordered $2 billion of doses from Pfizer. They didn't give them money directly, but they guaranteed a market for and this was a remarkable achievement. Within 2 months, Moderna had a usable RMNA vaccine, and these vaccines were 90% effective, even though they wane over time. And finally, I think on China, Trump really got the measure of triumph. And when I say Trump administration, Jim Mattis wrote oversaw the defense strategy. H.R. McMaster oversaw the national security strategy. They both came to similar conclusions on China. There's been a lot of wishful thinking about China over the years, which is as their economy grows, they're going to liberalize, and it turned out to be precisely the reverse. They became more authoritarian as their economy grew. And I think Trump certainly got the measure of that, and the Trump team. So I think that those are the positive things. I think the three big negative things I put in three buckets. One is he's the first president in history to consistently and publicly refuse to accept that he lost the election. And, this doesn't help our politics at all. And there's no other president who's done anything similar. The second area, I think, with COVID, and I'm quoting here Dr. Deborah Birx, who was his coronavirus coordinator, she told the congressional committee that 30 to 40% of the deaths under President Trump could have been saved with different policies. And that's 400,000. So doing rough math, it's about 130,000 lives. And he didn't model good behavior. He almost never wore a mask. He denigrated mask wearing. Before the vaccine, it's hard to remember, but the only way you could not get the virus and in a pretty bad way was social distancing and mask wearing. And he didn't federal guidance on masks. He denigrated masks. He encouraged social distance, getting together long before it was really safe. Famously, he said, "We're going to be together for Easter," early in the pandemic, and said a lot of misleading things about the pandemic. And when he had an opportunity to do something publicly, which I think would have been highly significant, when he and Melania were vaccinated in the closing days of his presidency, he could have done that publicly. And given the amount of vaccine hesitancy in the United States, I think that would have made a big difference. And then the final basket, I would say, is, Trump came into office saying that he was a great deal maker. I don't think, I think the deals that he got involved in did not work out well. Beginning with the Afghan deal, the Taliban got everything they wanted, and we, the United States, got nothing. And of course, it was Joe Biden who went through with the deal, which I think was a big mistake. But here we had the Taliban. The UN issued a report on Friday, in fact, saying that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are very close. They say, this is an astonishing statistic, of 41 cabinet officials and senior officials in the Taliban government under UN sanction. There's no government in the world that I can think of where that's the case. This deal was a terrible deal. We got nothing from it. Taliban got everything they wanted, which is the country. They remained allied to Al-Qaeda. They didn't involve the Afghan government in peace negotiations. So that was one bad deal. Another bad deal was the whole the love letters that were exchanged between Trump. 27 love letters and 3 meetings didn't produce a relationship that actually produced results. And in fact, the North Koreans continued with their program, continued testing short-range ballistic missiles, and they're in a better place they were before Trump came into office. And the final deal that I think was pulling out of the Iran deal really was a mistake, because according to Trump's own intelligence agencies, the Iranians are really sticking to the terms of the deal. Jim Mattis, but his own Secretary of Defense, was asked a very direct question by Senator Angus King in congressional hearings. Do you think this Iran nuclear deal is in the interest of the American people and national security? And Mattis had a very simple answer. He just said yes. He didn't say anything more, because, of course, the more he said, the more he pissed off his boss. But there was a widespread agreement based on intelligence that they were sticking to the agreement. Trump pulled out after John Bolton came into office as the national security advisor. And the Iranians went from enriching 4% of uranium, which is the agreement and the deal, up to 20%. Now, 90% is what you need for a nuclear weapon. But the point is, they started, and they're closer to a nuclear bomb today. In fact, they probably have enough uranium for a nuclear bomb already, according to some reports. I think if you take that all together, I characterize this as the most incompetent presidency of the modern American era. Because ultimately, what's the commander-in-chief got to do? The commander-in-chief, his main job is to make the American people safe. And his policies on COVID. Look, when I finished this book, by the way, when I did the hardcover, I said, look, the president's, Harry Truman, his reputation has greatly improved over time. He took hard decisions, dropping the atomic bomb. David McCullough did a big biography, and I think that shifted people's views of Truman. So I asked the question, is it possible, and this is in 2019, is it possible that Trump, unlike every American president, he never served in public office, and he never served in the military. Every other president's either been in the military, served in public office, or done both. And so he came in, and I asked the question, is it possible that his reputation will improve over time? Because he was getting something, I thought, at the time. And but I think the denialism around the election is something that no other president has done. And then Trump never does any homework. He never trusts experts, and he always goes with his gut. And that might work in a Manhattan real estate deal, but it does not work when you have a complex crisis. It doesn't produce good public policy, and it didn't. That's not my opinion. the people who were serving him in the public health realm, found him very difficult to deal with because he wouldn't accept kind of basic facts around the pandemic. Anyway.
Well, in his real estate deals, you don't really need to accept basic facts. You just go file bankruptcy when it doesn't work out.
Well, yeah, and his approach worked fine for a family real estate company that wasn't that big and they were even that successful. But and the reason I think that it's important right now to be having this discussion is not his. If you look at polling data, in February, 54% of the potential Republican voters, according to a poll by CNN, said they would vote for Trump. Governor DeSantis of Florida came in at 21%, and everybody else has also ran at 1%. Or Mike Pence he's just not registering. So, I think it's as likely as warm weather in Mar-a-Lago this summer that Trump will run. And by the way, that would be a pretty good way of. It'd be a lot harder. Some of these suits that have been filed against him, it's a lot harder if he's either a plausible candidate, is the candidate who is running for president, and so there would be that advantage. And plus, of course, he wants to run.
Yeah.
And he has a good chance of winning the nomination and potentially winning the presidency because Biden is polling at 39% according to the AP. And we're going to get new inflation numbers. They're going to be. And inflation is like it's a particular tax on low-income, middle-income Americans. And it's also a tax on all Americans because everybody feels the effects of inflation, even if relatively well off. But particularly if you're lower-income, middle-income, Biden, could lose the election to Trump pretty easily right now. If it happened tomorrow, it would be an interesting question.
Yeah, it definitely would. Your assessments really surprised me because it seems so stable for those 4 years. Everything. Really, there was stuff going on behind the scenes. So let me touch on a few things. I noticed you guys changed the title, I think, of the book from the hardcover to the paperback. What was the reasoning behind
the hardcover was called Trump and His Generals, and I think the subtitle was The Cost of Chaos. Let me double check. My COVID brain is.
Yeah.
Trump, so the hardcover was Trump and His Generals, and the subtitle was The Cost of Chaos. And that was really the first 2 years. The book was really about the first 2 years, or maybe the first 2.5 years. So, but I was able to revise this, and we thought that the Trump and His Generals wasn't really an accurate account of what was in the revised version, which is substantially updated and revised. So,
do you cover let's see, you covered the Iran thing in there too as well, and then pulling another thing. It looks like you basically talked about Jim Mattis as general, John Kelly, H.R. Master, and what they went through. And then do you cover Milley in the updated version of the book? Or?
Yeah, because I work at a think tank, New America, which you mentioned in the intro. And one thing, I thought it would be an interesting research project to track what retired and active duty 3-star and 4-star generals, officers were saying about Trump. Because we have a tradition in the United States of retired 4-stars. The more senior you are, the more you stay out of politics or try to. And Trump really changed that. And it wasn't the insurrection on the Capitol Hill that really changed it. It was the events on June 1st at the White House, where for the first time since General MacArthur, one of Trump's heroes, cleared a group of men who were camped out when President Hoover was president. It was the first time that armed force had been used against protesters outside of the White House. And I think that was really an inflection point. General Milley was in uniform going to this photo op with, he apologized for it very clearly 3 days later. He did a graduation commencement speech on video for National Defense University. And he said, look, it was a mistake for me to, and all the kind of chiefs, the active duty chiefs can't directly criticize Trump, but they all released statements saying we defend the Constitution. They made it very clear. And my team and I counted about 300 statements about Trump by 3 stars and 4 stars. The reason we cut it off at 3 stars and 4 stars is to get to a 3-star position or a 4-star position. Usually it's quite hard, right? A lot of 1 stars. And so we kept it at that level. These are the leaders of the U.S. military either. And there were about 300 statements, 250 of them were critical of Trump. And a lot of them came, and what was very interesting, Chris, after the White House incident where he held up the Bible and the protesters had been cleared, was Admiral Mike Mullen came out and criticized Trump by name. Now, Mullen hadn't said anything about Trump at all. He was a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs. John Dempsey, another chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had never said anything about Trump publicly. Powell came out. Colin Powell now, of course, just recently died. Colin Powell came out very strongly against Trump, and it had made other public statements. But you had a bunch of very senior retired officers criticizing Trump, and then also active duty criticizing him obliquely, not by name, but saying, hey, we protect the Constitution. So I see the White House event as being the kind of moment when he lost the military. And this is the guy, I wrote a book called Trump and His Generals, because when he came to office, no modern American president had an active duty 3-star on his staff, H.R. McMaster, as a national security advisor, and a retired 3-star General Mike Flynn, who McMaster succeeded, Mattis, a 4-star at defense, John Kelly, a 4-star retired at both at Department of Homeland Security and Chief of Staff. So, but the military turned against Trump then, and so when the January 6th insurrection thing happens, the General Milley, I'm just responding again to the question about Milley, released a very unusual public statement. He sent a note to the 2 million members of the armed services, which is the active duty National Guard and Reserve, just saying President Joe Biden is going to be the 46th president of the United States, and we don't condone any of this insurrection. And this is a guy who came into office very much besotted by the military. He wanted to have a big military parade in Washington. He went to a military-style boarding school in Vietnam when he was a teenager, and then, of course, avoided service in the Vietnam War. But he's always been very interested. General Patton, General MacArthur are two of his heroes. And he really lost, I think, the support of a lot of the senior officers.
Do you think that in the last days of, I think after he lost the election, they installed a couple of his goons to head over the Pentagon, and the move almost looked, to a lot of people that were watching and reporting it, the move almost looked like he's going to try and seize the government. He's going to pull a coup. Yeah. You've been watching, I think it was H.R. McMaster was his first general, and you watched how corny it was to have him announce it and talk to him on some couch. I think it was at Mar-a-Lago in the Trump Tower. And you could just see the kid-like adulation of authoritarianism in Donald Trump. I've got my generals or something. There was a comment that he made about that. There was just,
he definitely referred to them as my generals. Of course, I don't think I think he misunderstood a lot of what the U.S. military stands for, because the U.S. military is not an authoritarian. It's not in the business of supporting authoritarian leaders, and they swear an oath to the Constitution, not to a particular president. Mm-hmm. And so I think he really misunderstood. I don't have this in my book, but Mark Esper, who was his Secretary of Defense, who did come out with a book recently, talked about Trump wanting to shoot at protesters. This is somebody who didn't understand the ethos of the military is very much opposed to the kinds of things that some of the things that Trump wanted. And I think he just misunderstood the military. He hadn't been around. He had no experience really of the military. Going to a military-style boarding school doesn't mean that you understand the ethos of the U.S. military. And he didn't serve in Vietnam. He took 5 deferments. There don't seem to be people in his family. It's not like he was coming out of a family that had experience with the military. So I think he just misunderstood the military, and they began to draw away from him. And Mark Esper, during that run up to the White House, demonstrations outside the White House, talked about dominating the battle space, which was a very unfortunate thing on a conference call with American governors. But he himself, I think Esper, who was a West Point graduate, shortly after that White House event said, hey, there's no world in which the Insurrection Act can be invoked against these protesters. And I think he, like pretty much any other person who served in the military at any level who became part of this administration, put some distance between themselves. And I think you used the word goons about people that Trump put in at the end. He wasn't putting in goons, I don't think. Yeah, I know. And Mark Esper, he's a West Point graduate. He had served. He's not. I mean, I'm just saying, he's certainly in normal administration. He never would have become Secretary of Defense. He wasn't Jim Mattis. And then there was also Chris Miller, who's a retired special operations colonel. He was also promoted after Esper was fired by Trump. And in a normal administration, also, he wouldn't have got the job. But Chris Miller certainly served as a special operations colonel, ran National Counterterrorism Center, had a senior job doing counterterrorism in the White House. I would just be careful about using the word goons. What I would say is that in a normal administration, the Secretary of Defense is like Leon Panetta or, a Bob Gates or somebody who's like pretty much a really well-known household name or has some real gravitas and based on their career, And that was not the case at the end of the Trump administration. It was harder and harder for him to find people.
And just for me to clarify, when I meant goons, I wasn't referring to Mark Esper because we're friends on LinkedIn and talking about having him on the show. There was, right before January 6th, there was 2 or 3 people that they installed that had no business being over at the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And they were believed the people that interfered with sending the National Guard out to the January 6th thing. Those are the goons that I'm referring to.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Some people that were inserted who were Trump loyalists who were, yeah.
And the question was, a lot of the press was saying, what are these guys over there doing? Why would you send these guys in the last few days of your presidency, couple of weeks of your presidency? What are they mucking about? And I think one of them was the author of the order that told the National Guard to stand down on January 6th, or to make it so that the response wouldn't come there.
Well, even on that, there was a good reason why you wouldn't necessarily there was a discussion about having the National Guard at the Capitol. And I think there was also a discussion of maybe it wouldn't make sense for the National Guard to be at this event.
Yeah.
Because of the message it would send. That turned out to be the wrong decision, but you could also see why, having armed people around the Capitol there might be a reasonable debate about that.
Yeah. So you talk in your book about how the Pentagon, with some of the generals, they slow walked his stuff. They ran a little interference, and of course he had to deal with the Pentagon. Do you think that really helped keep us from falling to an authoritarian takeover, that delineation line that we have with the Constitution, and where our military people do say allegiance to whoever the presidency, the commander-in-chief, but it is also to our Constitution. And I believe that is the be-all and end-all, the Constitution part.
Yeah, I think the military turned out to be a big break on any plans that Trump might have had to stay in office. They just weren't going to go along for the ride. And also the judiciary as well. Yeah. 50 lawsuits were filed by Rudy Giuliani and others who are supporters of Trump, and they all got thrown out. The system worked. Now, will the system work again if Trump's back? If he runs and fails to win, will he claim fraud? Or if he wins, I don't know. I think the system did work, but the difference is now you have people being voted in as Secretary of State who seem to embrace, and then they have Secretary of State in state offices, and they have a role in elections.
Yeah.
So you could see that the system is potentially more amenable to these claims of fraud from a system point of view.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm glad you document this stuff so that people can really look at it, because the Trump administration was such a PR machine. Half the time they would do stuff, or Obama did something and they would just ride off it. Oh, we made that happen. And they ran such a PR machine, and the truth lies somewhere in between.
Certainly Trump was very successful at using Twitter, but I think I'm not confident that the PR machine for the Trump administration particularly worked that well. No one believed Sean Spicer when he said the largest inaugural crowd in history. I mean, it was factually not correct. But what's so fascinating about the country at large, and I'm zooming out past Trump, is what really matters to people aren't facts, it's narratives. And so people of all persuasions are looking for facts that fit their own narratives, or facts, pretend facts that fit their narrative. And as human beings, we're very strongly programmed to we tell ourselves stories all the time, which we believe, and we find things that fit into it. And unfortunately, that has become more pronounced. 15% of Americans in polling believe the QAnon conspiracy theory that there's a satanic cult running the country, and that number goes up, I think, to 21% of Republicans. So personally, I'm not one of those people. And I just passed Comet Pizza just 2 days ago. Newsflash, there isn't a basement in Comet Pizza where groups of pedophile Democrats are plotting to take children. Somebody from North Carolina, I think, came to Washington believing that with a rifle and started shooting at Comet Pizza. And so that's obviously a very extreme version of this, but I think that the issue around truth, 3/4 of Republicans in recent polling don't believe that Joe Biden legitimately won the election. This is obviously very corrosive to our body politic. If this becomes just a feature of the way our politics happen, that's difficult.
Yeah, it's and everybody knows John F. Kennedy isn't really running the. I saw one of the guys at a Trump thing, and the guys, John F. Kennedy's running the presidency right now, and John F. Jr. is running the vice presidency. Everybody knows that's not true. It's FDR who's actually running everything. So I just want to correct that for everybody. And the world is flat. So and it's not flat. It's more like a rolling, bumpy thing. I don't know what that means. But Peter, this has been pretty insightful. I'm glad you called it out and made the assessments and set the record straight so that people can see how dangerous our world would become. I remember watching CNN on Trump's inauguration night or Trump's election night, the day after, and CNN had two Italian journalists on the show, and they go, "You just elected Silvio Berlusconi, and way to go! You elected his twin." And here we are with what you've talked about. We may do the second round of Silvio Berlusconi.
Yeah, and didn't Berlusconi himself, I think, got a second round. So,
yeah. And no one prosecuted him either. So he had his own Merrick Garland, I guess.
He had what were referred to as bunga parties, which
yeah.
But one thing I think in Trump's defense, I would say is I thought it was fascinating that George W. Bush gaffe about them, and Trump didn't make this huge unforced error that George W. Bush did make in Iraq. I'm not quite sure what that means. Every president, we have a very strong presidency. It's an imperial presidency in many ways, and the commander in chief. There's a reason why it's important about who we put in, who we vote for. But yeah, let us see. 75 million Americans voted for Trump. He's very popular still in lots of parts of the country, and the Democrats need to. One of the easiest things in politics is to say we need better communication. I don't think that's. I think what do Americans care about? They care about inflation. They care about crime. And if politicians are talking about other things, I think they care about the kinds of things that we saw unfold in Texas, the massacres. I mean, I thought it's interesting that Biden has really moved, who I think fundamentally is a centrist Democrat, definitely was not embracing the defund the police move, because I think that, even in Minneapolis, where that movement to some degree began, that failed, the defund the police. I think we all know what
Let me ask you this, based on your book and your assessment in writing the book, and of course going back and reconciling after January 6th, because that's a hell of a seminal moment. I think your book came out in December 2019 on the hardback.
Yeah.
Do you think that if Trump were to win an election again, or let's say, for instance, the House of Representatives in 2022, the GOP takes the House, appoints him Speaker of the House, they impeach the Vice President and President like they've talked about doing, reinstalls him. Do you think if he gets the presidency again, are we going to be even more in danger than we were as his original presidency?
Well, I think that's a loaded question, and I'm going to answer it in a different way, which is if you do the thought experiment where COVID hadn't happened, I think Trump would have comfortably won.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and then this all the kind of denialism about he would have won. It would have been a kosher victory, and I think it was his kind of incompetence. When I wrote the hardcover, one of the conclusions I said was like every president since FDR has said something really big happened on their watch, that they either rose to the occasion or they didn't. And even Bill Clinton had a mostly pretty. But I grew up on his watch, and he had the embassy attacks and the USS Cole. He responded. George H.W., of course, had 9/11. George H.W. had Saddam invading Kuwait. Usually there's a crisis, and the presidents are graded on how they respond to the crisis, not just like to what business as usual. And so if you go back to the end of 2019, Trump seemed to have some wins and some losses, but he wasn't the guy that, failed rather dramatically on the COVID pandemic, and he wasn't the guy who consistently pushes this, terrible lie that we election. And that makes him a very different person. And I think anybody listening to this can draw their own conclusions.
One thing that always used to bother me was who wrote the book Fear? It's one of the Watergate people.
Woodward.
Yeah, my brain's gone out the door. And either Fear or one of his recent books, I think it was his last one with Trump. Trump would say, "You will know me in the second term." And he kept saying that, and that used to just make my skin crawl. And I agree with you. I think Trump would have won. I think Americans care about their pocketbook more than everything. That's why people vote for fascism and authoritarianism. The trains run on time.
Yeah, well, that's a complicated question. There's a whole set of circumstances why Mussolini did well in Italy and why Hitler did well in Germany. But yeah, they came out of the Great Depression, right? So, I mean, front and center of people's concerns at the time. But we're not in the Great Depression right now or anything close.
It could be. We're going into a recession, so and
Yeah,
gas is $9.
people
Yeah.
blame the guy, the person who's the president for the economic situation, but for which, of course, easy money from the Fed and COVID itself and supply chain issues in China and the invasion of Russia into Ukraine, all these things are because inflation is happening everywhere. It'd be one thing if inflation was only happening in the United States, but it's a global phenomenon. So it's hard to say, but Biden will get stuck with it. He knows that. And that's what did Jimmy Carter. And if I was a betting man, I would say, that right now it's highly unlikely that Biden would win an election against Trump if it was today.
Yeah, I don't think he would win. I don't think he's going to win no matter what it is. And I'm a moderate Democrat. And I was thinking very heavily the other day that, Jesus, this is turning into like the Jimmy Carter era. And then I don't know. It's really interesting to me. He's a good president. He does what he's supposed to do. He does the empathy thing. But it's almost like we've become a nation that embraces people like Trump. We're the Kim Kardashian, Jerry Springer sort of nation where we want white trash politics as opposed to just somebody do the job well. And sometimes I wonder if that's going to be our downfall. I don't know.
I have always found Neil Postman, who wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. Neil Postman wrote this in 1985. He says, our politics, religion, and news have been transformed into congenial adjuncts of show business, largely without protest or even much popular notice. The result is that we're a people on the verge of amusing ourselves to death. And I think that he wrote that in 85, and I think that gets to what you're saying, which is the politics is fundamentally a pretty boring business of compromise and votes. And so people want something more exciting, and certainly Trump delivered that. And I think you're right about Biden. And Biden has been, I think, a competent president in terms of getting COVID relief passed and trying to get the economy in shape, and trying to get infrastructure passed, which is popular, but it hasn't translated. Now, in fact, if you look at Biden's favorable ratings, they never recovered from the Afghan debacle. He dropped. Now, of course, the reasons now are very different, but he dropped, I think, to like low 40s immediately after that because it seemed projected to like a total feeling of incompetence and not feeling, but it seemed very incompetent. And he didn't recover from that. He hasn't recovered from that. So we'll see. Of course, a lot of things can change the next year or two. And I think on Ukraine, he's done a very good job of doing precisely what Trump tried to undermine, which is build up the NATO alliance, confront Putin. And I think he's done that quite skillfully.
Yeah, it's interesting what you were saying about that gentleman who wrote that in the 80s. I was just looking up here, when was Newt Gingrich Speaker of the House? And it was in the 90s. He sure nailed it because I think that's when some of our politics went downhill on the hill.
Went out of his way to blow up what he saw. Part of this, I think, is about the Cold War, which is there was such agreement between both sides of confronting the Soviet Union that papered over a lot of our differences. But yeah, I was a very relatively young reporter covering Capitol Hill for CNN. We were making a documentary. And back in the day, the Speaker of the House would get like 3 people to his press conference. And Newt Gingrich got 300 people journalists come to his press conference. And he was a phenomenon. He was planning to really blow up the old system, which was the Tip O'Neill, Reagan. We may disagree with each other, but we're going to work together. And, Newt really succeeded in that. And it was an early embracer of Trump and that kind of politics. And that kind of politics is largely defined. See, there's going to be a new book by Dana Milbank coming out in August called The Destructionist, a 25-year crack-up of the Republican Party. Jenny's going to unpack a lot of that. But we know, and then John McCain contributed to this by embracing, the governor, Sarah Palin. She wasn't a serious politician. She was a good politician, but she wasn't really a serious person. Yeah, I think you trace back a lot of this to Newt and the people that he brought in and his view of how to change in Washington.
Yeah. It'll be interesting to see how it shakes out. I'm going to just strap myself in and go for the ride. Anything more you want to tease out on the book, Peter, before we go out?
Well, thank you for having me on the show. I think, just to return to one of the themes we discussed, I do think that Trump really lost the support of the senior military, which that's also something new in this country. I don't know enough about American history, but when your own chairman of the Joint Chiefs is publicly taking you to task to the armed forces, I think that is new. And one thing that is we have to be very careful of in this country is there is a reason that the U.S. military so widely has very high approval ratings. Apart from all the obvious things, they're also regarded as non-political. And if you do the thought experiment where, let's say, Kamala Harris is president in the next cycle, and there are a bunch of retired 4-star and 3-star taking her to task publicly, it's a slippery slope. The more that these senior guys, and they are mostly guys, get involved in politics in one way or another, that is a kind of a norm which we need to think about pretty carefully. It's a norm you don't really want to erode. But it began to erode. It's been eroding for a while. Admiral Crowe, you may recall, Chris, was the first chairman to endorse, he was retired to endorse Bill Clinton. Mm-hmm. And now it's pretty routine. Every time now you have any candidates running, you have hundreds of retired generals and admirals signing up for one side or the other. And maybe that's a reflection of how divided we are as a nation and the kind of increased polarization. Because, of course, the military they're also American citizens, and they're going to be affected by the politics just as much as anybody else.
That's true.
But I think if I'm leaving, the final thought would be, it's not a great position for the military to be in, to be seen as increasingly politicized, even if they're taking the positions that a lot of people think are correct. That is a slippery slope.
Yeah. That's the one that I was watching that's really the one thing that separates us from nations that either have like Myanmar or Egypt, where the military steps in and interferes or coups or basically takes out someone they don't feel is doing the job. There's a kind of, I don't know if you call it a thin line, but there's definitely that line of separation with our military. And I think there was concern with, it was General Milley or the new general who they were concerned about the QAnon sort of infection in the ranks of the military.
Well, Lloyd Austin, who's the Secretary of Defense, certainly being concerned about extremism in the ranks. And I think, that's something that they're, are being very, they're being pretty proactive about. But the country, you mentioned Myanmar and Egypt, I would say even more, Pakistan is a sort of quasi-democratic society in which the military has pretty much a lot of veto power over who gets in or out. And that is not a place you want to be.
Yeah.
And I don't think we will be, because I think that the military showed that it had absolutely no interest in going down this path. They swear on a Constitution, not to a person.
It was very chilling to hear General Milley. It was recounted by someone say at Biden's inauguration, we landed the plane, and he was sweating it up until that moment. And then I believe General Milley had also told the Pentagon and people to stand down in case there was a call for some sort of, much like what echoed with what they did with Nixon when Nixon was drunk walking around the White House talking to portraits of Washington and Lincoln. And so I don't know if you touch on that in your book.
No, I don't. I'm aware of the reporting. I don't know. So
yeah, interesting stuff. It's been wonderful to have you on, Peter. Thank you very much for coming on and spending some time with us today.
Thank you. Enjoy your Memorial Day.
There you too as well. Also, give us your plugs, your .com, so people can find you on the interwebs and get to know you better, please.
PeterBergen.com is my personal website.
There you go, guys. Order it up. It comes available on paperback, the updated paperback, tomorrow, May 31st, 2022. If you're watching this 5 to 10 years from now, people are still watching our stuff from 12 years ago. The Cost of Chaos, the Trump administration and the world, and hopefully people that are watching this 12 years from now, we're still here. So we'll put that in the time capsule. Thanks to Peter for being on the show with us. Thanks to my audience for tuning in. Be sure to go to youtube.com/Chris Voss. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss. All those places those crazy kids are playing. Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, all those places you can find the show. Thanks for tuning in. Be good to each other. Stay safe. And we'll see you guys next time.
Chris, thank you for having me.